earlier we were talking about taking the stimulus money. The last month, the government passed a $2 trillion stimulus package, and another one that's probably going to get passed today. What should companies be thinking about if they're going to be taking that money? I would imagine documentation is a big issue, but what kinds of things should companies be doing to make sure that they're on the straight and narrow if they're taking money?
Yeah, now I will preface this and say I'm not an expert on the program, but I have spent the better part of my career focused on fraud, and so and certainly I'm working with people across our firm to learn more about it, but I think there's a few things that people should be focusing on. You mentioned the first one, Margot, which is really around the documentation, the controls, the compliance with regards to the receipt of funds is going to be critical. There are requirements around documenting that, how you're going to spend it, when you're going to spend it, how you're going to spend it. I think maintaining records to really validate is going to be critical. We expect to see, even from an operational and programmatic perspective, I think there's going to be increased risk. There may be policies and controls in place right now that really are not sufficient to address this. And so you've got some legacy considerations. How are we quickly going to pivot and get some policies, procedures, SOPs, whatever it may be in place to help us manage and mitigate this? Resources is going to be a challenge. Mm-hmm. Many organizations are really struggling with resources, again, for some of the workforce things we talked about, but also because in many instances, it's all hands on deck. I've talked to a lot of clients within legal and compliance, internal audit, and the focus is shifting very quickly to maybe some of the things that we traditionally do that appear now to be nice to haves, we're not focused on. We are all focused on, whatever the 2 or 3 main things are, and we see organizational shifts. What that does, though, is put a strain on resources. And so I think that's going to be a critical element of how we manage these funds. When we think about the integrity of the stimulus package itself and the program integrity, it's really around, we do expect to see, and again, this is based on history, higher error rates, a reduced emphasis on the prevention. And so it's like, we got to get the money out, and then it's a pay and chase, scenario that companies will find themselves in, which is, that was not right. Now we got to go get it back. So because, again, resources have shifted. Maybe everyone's not on the prevention. It came out very quickly. Applications went in fast. I mean, we all saw how quickly, at least for small business, the funds were disseminated. I don't really gamble or bet, but I would bet that there were falsified applications. There was falsified payroll to be qualified for those sorts of things. We're going to see new types of fraud come up. We're really not sure what they're going to look like. They will present themselves. We're going to see more bad actors. Again, this is a perceived opportunity. When you put $2 trillion plus flowing out very quickly, there is going to be fraud. And so those are just a few things. I mean, as we think about, as companies kind of grapple with that, I think there's really those 3 areas. It's operational. What are we going to do around that? From a program perspective, what do we need to be doing? What do we have in place that can help us? What do we need to create and get quickly up to speed? And then from the integrity of the funds themselves, what are we doing from a documentation perspective? How are we ensuring that we're spending it appropriately and that we're doing it within the confines of the package?
Mm-hmm. So are there particular groups inside the company that the compliance professionals should be certain to ask questions of and stay connected with, just to sort of tamp down any potential abuse of the stimulus money?
Well, I think stimulus and then beyond just regular fraud, absolutely. In many organizations, the ethics compliance officer may have the overall ownership of the fraud risk management program, but there's many other important stakeholders: finance, risk management, legal, internal audit, HR. So I think that, like with any significant fraud risk, there's going to need to be a lot of coordination. I think that oftentimes is the challenge when something happens so quickly and our environment is changing so fast. It's getting our arms around how do we handle this? What's the most important thing? And who are we talking to? I think that you want to ensure, to the extent possible and as quickly as possible, that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. So coordination across that, I think from an operations perspective, that's important. There's tax considerations, that's important. There's a lot of stakeholders in this when we think about the stimulus package, but just beyond that from a fraud perspective.
Great. Okay, so now I want to switch to some of the areas of consideration that will impact fraud during the crisis. This is slide 5. Let's talk about these in particular, Holly, in whatever order you think is correct.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of maybe start. I just talked about where we see some of that increased pressure. So maybe we'll start with kind of where that manifests itself. As I look through this, probably some of that pressure is going to manifest itself in the financial reporting. And I would say financial reporting, liquidity, going concern, those are all kind of interrelated. From a, like I said, we expect to see financial reporting increasing. Why? Well, it could be because we have liquidity issues, or we are not sure kind of how long we're going to make it. And maybe there is that pressure internal that they have the feeling that they're going to record some things, not show the full impact of it in an attempt to, save the company, or, we're going to come out of this. Now, this environment is different. We have not gone through this before. I've lived, I'm sure many of us on the phone, I was doing this back during 9/11, during the 2008 crisis, during the previous recessions. This is different. So I think, many companies, fraud or not, are going to be grappling with liquidity and going concern. But what that does is it increases pressure on people. And again, I mentioned it earlier, desperate times call for desperate measures. And sometimes that calls for, it doesn't call for, but it leads to people making some really bad decisions, which kind of leads us to that ethical misconduct. Mm-hmm. And we'll touch on some of this. We expect to see an uptick in ethical misconduct, and that can run the gamut. It could be from workplace violence. I would expect maybe to see that. We're certainly seeing an uptick in the non-workplace from that perspective, which is, is sad and just given all the stress that people are under. But I think that may be something we see. I think we'll see an uptick in just our general theft, the different schemes on ways to get money out the door. We expect to see, as I mentioned earlier, an uptick around dealing with third parties, whether that's, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, whether it's an FCPA violation or whether it's just kind of local and domestic. But I would expect to see an uptick on that where people are saying, hey, we got to make a deal. So I'll give you this, you give me that, whatever that may be. Workforce, that's another one. We talked a little bit about that. Workforce and internal controls somewhat go together. When we see a displaced workforce, such as what we're seeing, again, I mentioned that, all the different ways, whether it's furloughed, whether it's changing my responsibilities, whether there's been layoffs and now I'm doing the jobs of 3 people. Oftentimes, internal controls don't catch up or are not being updated alongside all the different changes that are happening in the workplace. So let's think about a few of them, right? Delegation of authority. That's a huge control, and it's a huge anti-fraud control. When we see people shifting, are you able to maintain that delegation of authority? Manual controls. How are you mitigating some of those risks where there's manual controls in place where you're not physically in the same place? And so companies are quickly having to think about that. System access. That's important on a number of levels. Certainly those of you, there's SOX controls. Each of those are SOX controls for those of you that are public filers. But there are also significant anti-fraud controls. And when we start to see that displacement and the workforce is disrupted, access to systems may change. I may actually have access to, the ability now because of whatever happened. Maybe my colleague is no longer doing this, where I have access to the accounts payable system. So I typically, maybe I'm a processor and I can approve payments going out, but typically I did not have the ability to add suppliers, vendors, or third parties to the AP system. Maybe now I do. Well, what does that lead to? A significant increase in fraud, because when you have access to those two, you have access keys to the kingdom, and that's a significant way that money is going out in an organization. Disclosure fraud. Financial reporting disclosure, we've mentioned that. We expect to see an uptick in that, where there is, we're not showing the full picture from a financial perspective, where we are not maybe reporting our contingencies correctly, where we are not accruing for things that we know that are coming. And what that leads to then is obviously inquiries from the regulators, upset shareholders, shareholder lawsuits, and so on and so forth. You can kind of look down the road and see what some of these impacts are going to have. And then,
so the public companies are supposed to be disclosing in their filings what impact they think COVID will have on their future earnings and those sorts of things, correct?
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And then from a culture perspective, the culture erosion, culture is so important in the fight against fraud. And it's really something that should be on the front lines of your fraud risk management program. Again, when we see all these things happen, it may be time to step back and say, what is the impact of this on our culture? What are we doing to appropriately mitigate that? Are we getting messaging out there? Are we being forthright with our employees? Are we being transparent on the impact to the organization? All these things can have a positive benefit to the culture, even when it's in very trying times. And so when we see that culture erode, when we start to not hear anything from management, that's when, again, all these other things start to rise up a little bit. No news is not good news during times.
So even if the management team is sort of scrambling to figure out what they're supposed to be doing in terms of their financial reporting or business operations or whatever, it's still important for them to be communicating with their teams and pushing down their culture, values, and messages.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ethical messaging is one of those things, as I mentioned earlier. This is a time to really step back and go, what do we need to maintain right now, right? What must we continue to do as we navigate this path, even though we're focused maybe more operationally? We've got internal control considerations. But as you step back and consider what's most critical, I think ethical messaging and continuing to have that transparency from the top is critical.